Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, students. Whenever you're watching this, this is technically the last normal time window live stream review session for AP Macro. In this video, I'm going to be going through a 6-graph shift problem. It's a thing that I kind of made up on my own, where I create a scenario that I can then sort of show through each of the 6 major graphs of this course. There are technically a total of 7 graphs, you should know, because it would include the regular old supply and demand graph. But that applies to just one market, and that's more of a micro graph. So this is really the 6 graphs of macroeconomics. And those are, in this order, I think in terms of how we teach it, should be production possibilities curves, your first graph you ever learn, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, money market, loanable funds market, Phillips curve, and the foreign exchange market. Those 6. So I'll do a problem that hits all 6 of them. Not in that order, but I'll hit all 6 of them in this problem. I'm going to work through the entire problem. I'm going to explain every part of it, how I get from one graph to the other, to the other, to the other, and all that stuff. Important disclaimer for this, though. The AP Macroeconomics exam hasn't ever had a question that asks you really about more than 4 graphs in any one long FRQ. It's the most they've ever asked anyone to draw on an AP exam is 4 graphs, and they've asked questions that touch on 4 graphs in one problem a couple of times. The FRQ I did in our previous video is like that, where it's not making you graph 6 of 4 different graphs, but it's kind of referencing them, so you do have to know them fairly well. But knowing how to navigate all 6 graphs and how to go from one to the other, to the other, to the other is an incredibly helpful skill in general, because it'll show you how all of the connective tissue works between these graphs, and an excellent review tool. Because if you can understand every part of what I'm about to do here, if each of those things makes sense to you, you're in pretty good shape. Now, the last thing is, if you are trying to challenge yourself, if you are reviewing and you're feeling pretty comfortable and you want to really stretch your limbs, pause this video. When I show the question for the first time, I'm going to take some time a little bit at the start of the video to hit the question. You can see the question. I'll pause it. I'll go to the next page, pause, go to the next page, pause, because it's like 3 slides on a PowerPoint that I had to do this entire question. And work your way through it yourself, and then watch the rest of the video as I solve it. Try and do all of them, because it's a great review of how well you know your graph stuff, and an amazing review of how you know the connective tissue. See, I'm going through all those things today. I'll be starting off in about a minute here. Next week, the way this, or not next week, but the next 2 videos I do for this will be the final 2 videos for this year's AP exam. On Saturday, this upcoming Saturday, that is May 8th, I'll be doing a Super Saturday review session, and that'll include me going over basically every graph in the course in a decent amount of detail, as well as the other likely FRQ styles. That'll include an absolute and comparative advantage FRQ, and a bank balance sheet FRQ, because those are sort of our generic templates we see. There's some weird one-offs they've done over what things are counted in GDP or not, unemployment rate stuff. I'll show you those if I have time, but I'll hit on basically every normal FRQ sort of setup you've seen and hit every graph in the entire course. That's Saturday's review session. And then on Monday morning, the morning of the AP exam, from about 8 a.m. Central Time to 11:30 a.m., I'll be doing a cram session like I did last year, where right before the AP exam, every question you've got, throw them in the chat. I'll go over whatever you need me to go over, all that stuff. There's less of a structured plan to that, and more just I'll cover whatever you need that morning. Okay, but we're at 4:30 now, so let's get started. Let me double check that my live stream is working just fine on my end. And I want to make sure that everything's running smoothly. It should be. Nothing out here is different. Yep, that looks fine on my end. Okay. So the 7-graph shift. So I'm going to go through, not 7, sorry, 6. 7, it used to be 7 because there used to be another graph I could do, but I'm not going to cover the investment demand curve here. So the 6-graph shift problem. All right. Oh, it says 7 graph on the thing. Sorry, it's 6 now. It's 1 less than it used to be. AP exam trimmed an exam, which trimmed a graph off, which is very nice. It's the 6 graph problem. I'm gonna keep saying 7. It's gonna keep bothering you. I'm gonna fix this. Apologies. Wow, editing on the fly because I realized that I forgot that I trimmed out a graph from this because they no longer make me cover the investment demand curve. which is just good news for most of you. Okay. And then go to present. Oh. No, there we go. Okay. So, a 6-graph shift problem. I'm going to show you the problem first. If you want to try and attempt this entire problem by yourself without my help, I'm going to sort of semi-quickly show you each slide of this. It's a total of 3 slides. In underline, you can see what graph you're drawing for each part of this. These questions in between are incredibly important, as that is kind of how you are getting from this graph to the next graph, typically, is these little bridge questions. So as you go through these, read the questions very carefully. The things in between are asking for very specific information, which will help you get from one graph to the other. Even though the AP exam doesn't ask you to draw 6 graphs in one problem, I took each of these stems, like the 1, 2, 3, off of previously issued AP exam FRQs. So while putting all of them like Frankenstein's monster combined isn't a thing that they would do, each of them separately is like a regular thing that they would have asked you on the AP exam. So these are not like completely like useless scenarios or anything like that. So here's our first page. It has the Forex market and the aggregate supply and demand graph. The next page has the Phillips curve, which includes the long-run Phillips curve and the money market. So again, if you want to just go this question by question, pause on these different parts. And the last one is the loanable funds market, and then finally the production possibilities curve. So the 6 graphs we're doing in order are foreign exchange market, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, Phillips curve, money market, loanable funds market, production possibilities curve. So let's go through these one at a time. I'm going to explain everything every step of the way, and I'm going to draw every single thing on my handy-dandy whiteboard. So, background information for the question. Assume that the United States economy is currently operating at full employment and that the U.S. and France are trade partners with no barriers to trade. The U.S. currently has an interest rate of 3.5% and France has an average interest rate of 3%. Okay, U.S. and France are trade partners. There are no barriers to trade. Great. And U.S.'s interest rate is higher than France's. The number doesn't super matter, just that it's higher than France's is all that'll matter here. 1. Based on the difference between the interest rates in the two countries, draw what will happen on the foreign exchange market for the dollar as French consumers begin investing in the United States, and show how that will affect the exchange rate. I did take this verbatim off of an AP exam question. They gave this much information away on the question. You're not always going to be that lucky, but this AP exam question specifically gave away quite a bit. So I'm setting up my Forex market for the dollar. I've got quantity of dollars, supply and demand of dollars, and because France uses the euro, it is the amount of euros per dollar. This is my Y. Setting up my equilibrium. Normally on a foreign exchange market question, I tend to tell my students, hey, you should be thinking about this in terms of 2 graphs, one being the dollar graph, one being the euro graph. I'm already having you draw 6 graphs here. Let's just do one of them. Let's just do one of the 2. So I got my equilibrium, price and quantity at equilibrium. And now the idea is interest rates are higher in the United States than in France. And the question even tells you, I did take this straight from an AP exam question, that the French are going to want to invest more in the United States. The idea being, this is not investment spending, this is foreign investment. The idea is that people from France will see that higher interest rate in the United States as an opportunity to make some money. Whether that be buying U.S. government-issued bonds, whether that be buying U.S. stocks, which earn interest off of dividends, or buying, or just putting their money in a U.S. bank saving account, which is technically possible, is weird, and would probably cause some tax problems if you did that, but theoretically is possible. Most likely the bond thing. The bond thing is pretty likely. Well, if they want to invest in the United States, like U.S. banks like Wells Fargo doesn't really want euros. Like, that's cool that they've got them, but that's not what they really want. So if they want to invest in the United States, the people in France or the French consumers are going to need U.S. dollars, which means on the dollar graph, which is again the Forex market for the dollar, the international market for the dollar, we should see an increase in the demand for dollars because internationally, as these French consumers want to invest more in the United States, they will need and therefore want more U.S. dollars. So here is my first graph. First answer to this, the answer to number 1, is an increase in the demand for dollars, shown by increase in the demand curve. That's D dollars 1. I have a higher quantity of dollars being exchanged internationally, because if they want to invest more in the United States, then there will be more dollars internationally. And a higher exchange rate. If you look on the y-axis, I have a higher exchange rate. It'll now take more euros to get a dollar. So I got a higher amount of euros per dollar, and that's going to be my bridge material. My bridge from one graph to the other is going to be built off that exchange rate. So what will happen to exports for the United States as a result of the change in the value of the dollar identified in part 2? Well, we just said that it now takes more euros to get a dollar, which means that the dollar has appreciated in value. And when the dollar appreciates in value internationally, meaning it now takes more euros to get a dollar, literally, like it's literally going to take more euros to get a dollar, that'll mean for the United States, if American consumers want to buy European goods and they get more euros per dollar, then Americans could buy more stuff from Europe, specifically France, but they all use the euro, so it's fine. America should see an increased ability to imports, and they should also see a decreased ability to export. Because if your currency is worth more, if it again takes more euros to get a dollar, and you're European, that means that every American good just got more expensive for you as a European. That's not good, at least not for your ability to buy stuff from America. So that'll mean that America is exporting less and importing more. If the value of your currency goes up, your net exports go down. So what will happen to exports for the United States as a result of the change in the value of the dollar? Exports will decrease. If it asked you to explain it, you would say, because as it now takes more euros to get a dollar, it will be more expensive for people in Europe or France to buy American goods. So there'll be less exports. So exports are falling. That is my thing from 2, and that is how I'm going to this. And luckily, the questions will often tell you exactly what you need from the previous graph to get to this graph, which is great. Like again, I stole this from an AP exam question. Illustrate what will happen to the aggregate supply and demand curve based off of the change in exports from part 3 and include the long-run aggregate supply curve, and show how that change will impact the price level and real GDP. Okay, I'm going to erase my graph. So again, this is the graph and answer for number 1 and 2. Erasing it. For number 3, I am now doing an aggregate demand supply curve, and I have to draw LRAS. Where I draw LRAS will always matter, because it'll tell the grader as well as myself what is going on in this economy. So my x-axis on my aggregate demand supply graph is real GDP. My y-axis is price level. I have an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve and a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Now, if you're wondering how do I know where to draw LRAS here, you go back to the starting point. The very first sentence, the very first thing it says is that the U.S. economy is currently at full employment. Well, if I'm at full employment, that means my long-run aggregate supply curve is right through the middle of my SRAS and my AD curve. So this is my starting point for 3. This is what my graph should look like at the very jump of 3. I've got LRAS through the middle because I'm at full employment. So my short-run equilibrium, where SRAS and AD meet, should be right where LRAS is at, because LRAS is full employment. SRAS, AD, real GDP, YE, and PLE are my equilibrium points. It then says to show the change in the graph based off the change in net exports from part 3. Well, we said that America's currency is appreciating, so their exports should be falling, because if their currency is worth more, foreigners cannot buy as much of their goods. Net exports is a shifter of the aggregate demand curve, because it's a component of spending, right? Foreign spending still counts as long as it's on our stuff. So net exports are falling. That means overall aggregate demand for our goods will be falling. So a decrease in aggregate demand. A decrease in aggregate demand would cause price level and real GDP to fall, So I'm going to use arrows for that as well. I don't need to on the AP exam use arrows for everything. I just need to have the one arrow for my line shift on the AP exam. Make sure that your graphs in the AP exam have the arrows. That's very important. We got price level dropping, real GDP dropping. That's my situation here. It's got a decrease in aggregate demand. So I've shown what's happened on that graph. I'm not going to erase this just yet because I'm definitely going to need it. All right, so that's page one of the 6 graph shift done. We've got the first 2 graphs drawn and taken care of. You've got a Forex market graph where there was an increased demand for dollars. Then an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph where, due to the dollar appreciating, net exports fall, so aggregate demand decreases. So again, it's net exports is what got me there between those 2 graphs. All right, part 2, or the next page. Based off the change to unemployment rate and inflation rate as a result of the shift in part 4, that should say part 3, but I don't really care, what will happen to the Phillips curve? So, based off the change in unemployment and inflation rate as a result of this. So they're asking me what happened to unemployment and inflation rate here, and what's going to happen to my Phillips curve. Well, first, I'm going to write what happened to unemployment and inflation rate, because I want to have that indicated somewhere before I do my Phillips curve. So the things to know here are that real GDP and unemployment rate are inversely related, and that price level and inflation rate are positively related. So I got real GDP, unemployment rate, price level, and you see the pi here. The technical symbol for inflation rate is pi r. Don't worry about it. It's really weird that it's like that. So if you want to write inflation rate, write inflation rate. But we got real GDP, unemployment rate, price level, and inflation rate. My real GDP on my drawing, which I have up here, my real GDP went down because I decreased aggregate demand. And my price level also went down. Those are both on my drawing. So if real GDP is going down, that means that unemployment rate should rise, because if businesses are making less money, because lower real GDP, right? They won't be able to afford as many of their workers. So I should see an increase in unemployment. And if my price level is falling, my inflation rate should also be falling. Because if prices are starting to decrease, then inflation should be going down, if not outright drop. So I got real GDP down, unemployment up, price level down, inflation rate down. Now, for this question, it said, based off the change to unemployment rate and inflation rate, so I'm sort of like just circling those, I'm just circling those. Based off that, what's happening to my Phillips curve? Okay, Phillips curve time, here we go. Drawing a new graph, drawing so many graphs. This is the day where I draw lots of graphs. Okay. On your Phillips curve, your x-axis is unemployment rate. Be aware that you really shouldn't be abbreviating your axes kind of ever on the AP exam, outside of your aggregate demand supply curve, which you can abbreviate real GDP as RGDP or price level as PL. I'd still like write out your axes. When in doubt, you should always be writing them out. A lot of times the questions will tell you what the axes are indirectly. Like it says based off the change in unemployment rate and inflation rate. That is kind of a hint that this graph is those lines. Got SRPC, and I'm going to draw LRPC. It told me to, and I can draw it. Draw what happened on that graph. So, I've got my Phillips curve. I've got a long run and a short run Phillips curve. Now that current equilibrium I am at is not where I'm at after the shift. It is where I started at in this problem. Like this question said I started at full employment on my Phillips curve. This drawing right here is me starting at full employment. Me being right where LRPC and SRPC meet, that is full employment. Now, I have to then show the change in unemployment rate and inflation rate on my Phillips curve, which is relatively easy because those are the axes, and I just wrote down what happened to unemployment and inflation rate. My unemployment rate is going up, my inflation rate is going down, so I should have a higher X value and a lower Y value. Okay, well, if I need a higher X and a lower Y, I'd be moving like diagonally down on the graph, but hey, I can actually just follow the Phillips curve and get that to happen. like that. That by moving from that point where we're at long run equilibrium and moving that point down along my short run Phillips curve, I get a higher inflation rate and a lower unemployment rate, which checks out. Reminder that the way the Phillips curve works is that if I move my aggregate demand curve, I will shift along the SRPC. If I move my aggregate supply curve, I will shift the entire Phillips curve. So again, if I shift aggregate demand, I move along the Phillips curve. If I shift aggregate supply, I shift the entire Phillips curve. That's why you get a this. Okay. 6, which should be question 5, but I messed up numbers, so who cares? After the change in the U.S. economy, which this is phrased kind of bad, following the change in exports, should the Federal Reserve pursue expansionary or contractionary monetary policy? This is actually kind of asking me about that aggregate demand supply curve still, because that's the graph where this is most apparent. But if I started off at full employment and I saw a decrease in aggregate demand, what is going on in America's economy at that point? Again, graphically what's happened is my graph now kind of looks, I'm sketching this really fast, like that. I'm currently at that dot that is not at equilibrium anymore, like right there. If I were to label how this is going where I'm at right now, I would describe that as a recessionary gap or a negative output gap. Then in that situation, my GDP is lower than what it's supposed to be. I was at full employment and then my exports went down. No, I was at full employment, now I'm doing worse. That's not what I want. So what should the government do? The Federal Reserve, in this case, should pursue an expansionary policy. An expansionary monetary policy, which would include one of the 3 possible things that would work here, which is a decrease in the required reserve ratio, a decrease in the discount rate, or the Federal Reserve purchasing bonds on the open market. Any of those 3 things would be an example of an expansionary monetary policy, but I need an expansionary monetary policy. Because if I'm in a recession, I need the economy to grow and expand. So the next graph I'm drawing is the money market graph, and I'm drawing what's happening on that graph if they choose to do that expansionary monetary policy. Okay. Money market graph time. The money market graph has quantity of money as your x-axis and the nominal interest rate as your y. It has a vertical supply curve, that is the supply of money or the money supply, and a downward sloping demand curve, which is the desire for people to have money in a spendable form. It's not how much money you want, because again, that would be infinite kind of all of the time. It is how badly you want to have your money in a spendable form. Like as opposed to having money in your savings, you'd rather have it in your checking account, like that kind of thing. So here's my money market graph. I've got nominal interest rate as the y-axis, quantity of money as the x-axis. I got my equilibrium with QE, and I put IE here. They're pretty chill about what you do for your equilibrium labeling. If the question doesn't tell you what to label it, they're pretty cool about however you kind of want to label it. As long as you're labeling it, they're mostly okay with it. So like right here, what's my graph? Okay, so I did an expansionary monetary policy there because, again, by decreasing exports, we moved into a recessionary gap or a negative output gap. So we would ask the government to try and help out the economy, pump it up. If you want real-world example, we've been in a recession for about a year or year plus now, and the Federal Reserve about a month ago lowered the reserve requirement down to 0%, which is wild how low that is, in that now banks can loan out all of your money. But the idea is banks can loan out more of your money, which would be an expansion of the money supply. Expansionary monetary policy expands or increases the supply of money, because that is ultimately what the Federal Reserve ends up controlling and dictating, is the money supply. All of their policy actions, the reserve requirement, the discount rate, the buying and selling government bonds, is all about changing the money supply. By changing the amount of money that is accessible to the public, they're effectively determining how much money we can borrow and how much money we can spend. So we've got an increased money supply here because by doing whatever expansionary monetary policy they do, they're allowing for banks to lend out more money. So the supply of money is increasing as banks now have more to lend out and can then loan out more than before, and therefore through the multiplier effect, do a lot more damage, or in this case, positive, but conceptual damage to the economy. Higher quantity, lower nominal interest rate. So we have a lower nominal interest rate. That is probably the most important thing to get off of this. The higher money supply gets a lower interest rate. And then 8, due to the change in nominal interest rate from part 7, this previous one, what will happen to investment in the United States? Capital I investment is referring to investment spending, which is the spending done by businesses to accelerate their production. Usually it's spending on capital, things that helps the business produce stuff. So lower interest rates should lead to higher investment spending. Because if interest rates go down, loans get cheaper. So businesses can borrow and spend more, and they're incentivized to spend more because saving or buying like an asset is going to be less beneficial to you. Lower interest rates means, hey, I don't really want to like buy a bond or anything. I want to buy stuff because stuff will make me money. But a bond with low interest rate, ain't make me anything. Basically, physical assets get more valuable with lower interest rates. Financial assets get less valuable with low interest rates. Ooh. Sometimes stuff is complicated. Okay. So we have higher investment spendings, what should happen because of the lower interest rate. Last page of this thing. Based off of the change in the money supply from part 7. So not the interest rate thing yet. That's going to come up here in a second, but it's not here yet. Based off the change in the money supply, it went up. From part 7, draw what will happen on the loanable funds market. Show the impact on the real interest rate. This is a connection students tend to like not realize and then gets very obvious fairly quickly of like, oh yeah, that would make sense. Where the loanable funds market is the market for loanable money within our economy. And it's often just referred to as the market for loans, really, because that's what it's referring to. It is made up of the supply of loans, which is really just banks' ability to lend, and the demand for loans, which is really just everyone in your economy's desire to borrow. The x-axis is quantity of loans. The y-axis is the real interest rate, and it's real here, not nominal. That is worth mentioning. The reason why it is real and not nominal here is because loans, the actual price of a loan is the interest rate, so you would need the more accurate version of the interest rate for your loan supply and demand, because that's determining the actual payout of the loan. Like, interest rates aren't really the price of money, so like nominal is fine there. You would want real for loans because the price of a loan is the interest rate, so you would want the most accurate version of that. So here is my loanable funds market graph. It is a normal supply and demand graph, like upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, all that stuff. And again, the shift I'm basing this off of is the fact that the money supply increased in part 7. I drew an increase in the money supply. Okay, well, money supply goes up. What happens on my money market, on my little funds market graph? I wonder. Well, let's explain that money market shift again. I said that there's an expansionary monetary policy, which is meaning that the Federal Reserve has done some action that will allow the public and banks to have more access to money. That there's more money that banks can loan out now. I'm going to say that one more time. There's more money that banks can loan out now. Banks can loan out more money now. Banks can loan out more money. I'm getting closer to the mic. Banks can loan out more money. Wait, banks can loan out more money. This is the market for loans. Oh my God. Right, and banks are the supplier of loans, right? Because they're like the business and loans are like their product. So supply of loans, if the money supply goes up, the supply of loanable funds is also going to rise. Because, and this is going to sound absolutely insane when I say it out loud, if banks have more money, banks have more money. So my money supply is going up. My supply of loans should also be going up most of the time. There are probably a couple of exceptions to this if you wanted to really like rack your brain of like, if only people in cash have more money and they don't put it in the bank, then the money supply would go up, but the supply of loans wouldn't. It's like, okay, that's a really specific caveat you have to put to make that true. But in general, if the money supply is going up, the supply of loanable funds should be going up as well, because if the Federal Reserve has done anything to allow for banks to have more money, that wouldn't preclude them from loaning that money out. It's kind of the whole dang point of them giving more money to banks. thus the supply of loans increases. So my real interest rate fell, which makes sense because my nominal interest rate also fell, so it would have been weird if one of them did and the other one didn't. Would have meant a lot of inflation's happening or a lot of deflation's happening. Either way, weird, don't like it. So nominal went down, real went down as well, so I'm pretty dang confident interest rates are going to fall here, which is the whole point of expansionary monetary policy, is we want to get interest rates lower, we want people borrowing and spending more. Cool. Last graph of the 6-graph shift. So in review, we did increased demand for dollars in the Forex market because people wanted to invest more in the United States. We had decreased aggregate demand because if your currency is worth more, net exports will start to fall. We had move down along to the right on your Phillips curve because lower aggregate demand gets you higher unemployment and lower inflation rate. We had increased money supply because if you are in a recessionary gap, you should be doing an expansionary monetary policy, which would increase the money supply. And we have increased the supply of loans because if banks have more money off of that expansionary monetary policy, they would also have more money to loan out, so the supply of loans should increase. Those are all my shifts so far in a row. 10. Draw a production possibilities curve. But what? Oh my god, what? The production possibilities curve here, but this isn't like pizza and bagels or random dumb things. This is like a real scenario, Mr. McRitchie. Yeah, we can do that for this too. With consumer goods on the x-axis, okay, this is Unit 1 review. Consumer goods are goods that we immediately use up, that is disposable stuff, so like food, water, paper, things that you use and they're gone. And then capital goods on the y, which capital goods are just referring to mostly capital, but it's stuff used to make stuff. With demonstrating increasing opportunity cost, that is telling me how to draw the slope of the graph. I would draw it like that. That's a pretty good curve. Where I would draw it having a bowed out or bowed out curve. Increasing opportunity cost is just referring to the slope of this line, and the slope is getting progressively steeper as we go. Like, starts off even, gets steeper and steeper and steeper, and oh my god, roller coaster, we're falling. Cool. So that's a bowed out curve. That's increasing opportunity cost. You could only see this as increasing or constant opportunity cost. And a constant opportunity cost PPC would just be linear, straight line. You won't ever have a caved in one. That won't ever happen here. None of your PPCs should look like your Phillips curve. Okay, based off of the change in investment from part 10, that's a typo. That should say like part 8. Draw what will happen on the PPC of the United States. So I did mention it. It could base it off of 9 or 8, to be honest. But I mentioned here that since the interest rate is falling in this economy, both nominal and real interest rate is falling in this economy, we should see a significant increase in investment spending. Because if interest rates are lower, loans are cheaper, businesses can borrow and spend more. How does that connect to my production possibilities curve, Mr. McRitchie? What the hell does that do to this? Great question, me. The way it affects it is investment spending is often on capital. Now, I know capital goods is your y-axis, but it's important that we understand the idea of capital stock. Capital stock is the total amount of capital that is accumulated within your economy. They mean physical capital, like tools, machinery, technology. They mean human capital, like your workers' knowledge and skills. They may even mean, and sometimes include, financial capital, which is actually money. No matter which of those we're talking about here, the capital stock of this economy has been climbing significantly. Because we had an expansionary monetary policy, so that there's more money in our economy, so financial capital, check. We have higher investment spending that is typically on capital, whether that be physical capital, like the businesses are buying more factories, computers, technology, production machinery, whatever, or human capital, say the businesses are using that loan money to finance training programs for their employees or to pay for their employees to get a master's degree, whatever. All those things should be going up. So there should be significant increases in capital stock. Why does that matter to this graph? Capital stock raises the ceiling of your economy. It's one of the things, if not the most important thing, in determining our economic growth. Not producing more for now, but producing more now and for the indefinite future, basically. Because if I have more technology, machinery, and tools, that doesn't just disappear, that stuff sticks around. If my workers get smarter, they typically don't just get magically dumber. They tend to be like smarter, and that's useful for quite a while. Like, that doesn't just disappear. Having more intelligent workers is a pretty good thing, not just now, but for a long time. So when you improve capital stock, you are effectively raising the ceiling of your economy. You are increasing your maximum level of production. And that's where we get to the production possibilities curve, because this tells me what production is possible in my economy. And I just said the maximum got increased. What's the maximum on this curve? It's the curve! So if my maximum's getting improved, whoop, whoop, my curve's getting bigger. Because here's the thing with capital stock. It doesn't just affect how many capital goods we can produce. It also affects how many consumer goods we can produce. Like food, we make a lot of food using technology. Like farmers use tractors. Meat processing plants are meat processing plants. Like most of our consumer goods aren't just like, ah, yes, I go to a tree and I slap it and now there's paper and I give it. That's not how it works. Like machines are used to make that stuff. So having more capital allows you to produce more consumer goods. It also for sure lets you produce more capital goods because we definitely use machines to make more machines. That's how machines work. So we do that, and my maximum level of productivity is higher. Effectively, when you have that increase in investment spending, and assume if it's for a long time you get an increase in investment spending, you should see more economic growth. Technically speaking, I could also show this with a rightward shift of my long-run aggregate supply curve. I wouldn't ever really draw that on my graph because they don't like you to draw moving the LRAS because it gets really weird in terms of recessionary and inflationary gaps. But I would be increasing my long aggregate supply because my potential output would be growing there. Remember that potential output, where I draw LRAS, is at my full employment level of production. So if I'm moving that thing rightward, my peak, my best case scenario productivity is rising, which is economic growth. If you need to review economic growth, it's under Unit 5. Unit 5 is economic growth in it. It's under Unit 5, review economic growth there. It's a fairly quick video to review. It's like a 10-minute video on that. On College Board's website, my video on that's like 15-20 minutes. It's a pretty short thing to review if you need it. But it's driven by capital. That's the biggest thing. An investment is usually on capital. So that's how you get that one. Okay. So in summation and review, that was all of 6 of the macro graphs. You should still know the regular supply and demand graph. That is like supply, demand, price, quantity of just one good, like the supply and demand of apples, and how the price of pears would affect the market for apples. It's all situational. That is a micro topic we cover in macroeconomics to show you how a supply and demand graph works and how those concepts work. You do still have to know that one. That's just not one that they can easily tie into the other graphs because it is about a specific individual market, whereas the rest of these graphs are about either the economy as a whole, like aggregate demand curve and Phillips curve, or a macro market that affects a bunch of things in the economy, like the money market, loanable funds market, or the foreign exchange market. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick summation review of all of these real quick and the connective tissue between them, and then we'll be done. So we started off with a foreign exchange market. I increased the demand for dollars on that foreign exchange market because America had a higher interest rate than France, and people in France will want to invest in the United States to chase that high interest rate and make as much money as possible off of it. So it was a higher demand for dollars. That higher demand for dollars will cause the dollar to appreciate, and if the dollar appreciates, exports for the United States would begin to fall. Because if the currency is worth more, you won't be able to sell as many of your goods overseas. Your goods have become more expensive for foreigners if your currency is now worth more. On my aggregate supply and demand graph, if exports are falling, just say part 2. If my exports are falling, then I should see a decrease in my aggregate demand curve, because aggregate demand includes net exports. It's CIGXN. Aggregate demand is made up of all of the spending in our economy, and if people are buying less of our goods internationally, there is a less spending of stuff made in our economy. So aggregate demand is going down. That'll decrease price level and decrease real GDP. When I do those, all of this got messed up because of that, but whatever. Gotta fix it. Apologies. The OCD has finally kicked in on these. There we go. Based on the change in unemployment rate and inflation rate, in the previous question, I had GDP fall, so unemployment rate will rise. I had price level fall, so inflation will fall, so lower inflation, higher unemployment. On my Phillips curve, I would start at equilibrium, where LRPC and SRPC meet. I would then move down along my Phillips curve to the right, because I would need to have lower inflation and higher unemployment. If I have higher unemployment than I'm supposed to have, which would be caused by this shift here, if I have higher unemployment than I'm supposed to have, then I would be in a recessionary gap or a negative output gap. So the Federal Reserve should pursue an expansionary monetary policy. If they pursue an expansionary monetary policy, the money market graph, vertical supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, supply of money, demand of money, should see an increase in the supply of money. Because if the Federal Reserve does an expansionary monetary policy, they will inject more money into the economy, whether they be buying bonds, lowering the reserve requirement, or lowering the discount rate. They'd be allowing for banks to have more access to money, could loan out more, we could borrow and spend more. So that's expansionary policy. That would increase the money supply and drop the nominal interest rate, because if I increase the supply curve there, I get a lower interest rate. Because of that lower interest rate, I get higher investment spending within the United States, because lower interest rates mean that businesses can borrow more from banks and spend more. Because the money supply went up on my loanable funds market, I should also see an increase in supply, because if banks were able to lend out more money on my money market graph, that logic wouldn't stop happening on my loanable funds market graph. That's the market for loans. So there'd be a higher supply there as well, because banks can lend more, which would increase the supply of either of those graphs. So I have a higher supply of loanable funds, so a lower real interest rate as well as a lower nominal interest rate. So both of those went down, which is great because it means my investment spending is for sure going up. And then with my production possibilities curve, I shifted the production possibilities curve outward, because as investment spending climbs, as that investment spending climbed up, then businesses are acquiring more capital. A larger total amount of capital stock is existing in this economy, which is raising the productive maximum of this economy. What it means to be efficient in this economy is now higher. The economy has a higher ceiling. Its full employment level of output is raised. All of those things mean the same thing. And it means the production possibilities curve shifts outward, gets bigger, get a bigger PPC out of it. I'm going to fix some numbers on these tables because I am incredibly bothered by this. No, it's 7. No, that's right. 7, 8, 9. Change investment from part 7. Yes, I have fixed it. Okay. So if you just tuned in and you heard everything that happened there, but it went in and out of your ears so quickly, like the fastest anything's ever gone in and out of your ears in your entire life, feel free to go through this problem. It is technically just one problem that has a total of 9 parts to it. And through those 9 parts, you will be able to hit pretty much all 6 of the graphs. Now, there's technically a 7th graph that we didn't mention here, which is the regular supply and demand graph. That is technically only a micrograph, but still shows up on the AP macro exam because it is a good introduction into these graphs. It's just not one that I can connect to the other graphs because it is its own separate thing. But going through this problem will show you each of the graphs and a way to connect it to another graph. Production possibilities curve, I can connect with investment spending because of capital stock. Loanable funds market, I can connect to money market because the supply of both of those curves is kind of the same thing. I can go from money market to aggregate demand supply because of investment here. That's also a possibility. I can go from aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and Phillips curve to the money market because of monetary policy, because I can be in a recession and they should want to do an expansionary policy, which, oh boy, changes the money market. I can go from aggregate demand supply to Phillips curve because of unemployment and inflation rate. That shouldn't be surprising. That it's like the entire thing with the Phillips curve. That's like how we do the Phillips curve. And I got from the foreign exchange market to the aggregate demand supply curve through the change in the value of the currency and how it affects net exports. So there's connective tissue between each of these graphs, and there's a couple more bits of connective tissue that exist than just this, but these are like the most obvious connections between each of the graphs. So hopefully this does help you in seeing all the graphs again and going through them one more time. Feel free to leave questions in the comment section below of things you might need extra help, support, or explanations with. Of course, there is more to this than this, only because this class is incredibly complicated because it's a giant spiderweb of a bunch of different things that are connected, and if you draw strings between all of them, you'll look like an insane person doing the Pepe Sylvia bit from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where you're making a massive conspiracy board trying to explain how aggregate demand changes literally freaking everything in the entire class, because that's what it looks like when you actually do it. It's insane. The better you know this class, the better. The more you know, the harder it does get, though. Because you'll be able to see, like, oh, wouldn't this change this? Wouldn't this change this? Wouldn't this change this? Yes. Almost always yes. There's a lot, though. The good news is your brain can still solve it, because it's all logical, which is the best part of econ, is that it's logical the whole frickin' time. Things are logical, it's great. Except for in the long run, then we kind of just assume things and hope it works out. All right. So this video was 6-graph shift. I went through all 6 of the major macroeconomic graphs you're required to know for AP macroeconomics. Showed you how to go from one to the other, all 6. Gave you one scenario that goes through all of them. So if you want a nice review of how to do all 6 graphs, here's a great problem, because all of those shifters between each of those graphs is kind of like a fairly basic shifter for each of those graphs. Interest rates in the forex market, yep, you should know that. Exports and aggregate demand supply, yep, you should know that. Phillips curve off of aggregate demand supply, yep, you should know that. Money market off of monetary policy, yep, you should know that. Multiple funds market off of money supply, yep, you should know that. And the last one, production possibilities curves off of investment spending, and therefore capital stock. You might not realize that, but you should know that too. Okay, that is it for this video. Once again, in terms of what's happening the next couple of videos, because if you watch these super late, I apologize. On Saturday, May 8th, and this is 2021 in case these videos stick around that long, I don't know. May 8th, I am doing a Super Saturday review session from 10 a.m. Central Time until 2 p.m. Central Time, going through should be every graph in the class in detail, like what is the demand curve on the money market graph, what things change, all that stuff. I'll be hitting on all of that. And then I'll also hit on the other FRQ setups that I've seen that are very common, your GDP math ones, your absolute comparative advantage terms of trade ones, and your bank balance sheet ones. Those are like 3 non-graph, pretty common FRQ setups to see. And that's on Saturday. On next Monday, that is May 10th, the day of the AP Macroeconomics exam, I will be going live at 8 in the morning Central Time until 11:30 in the morning Central Time, leading right up until the start of the AP Economics exam, reviewing whatever students ask me to review in that session. I'll be at the school for that video, so I'll have a full whiteboard to go off of. I will be bringing my mic and my camera to that. Can't bring my full PC. Might bring an extra monitor. Not sure about that, but I'm going to bring some equipment to the school to help do everything. I'll probably bring the ring light just to be safe. I have to bring a bunch of stuff to the school on Monday. Ugh, that's going to suck. Okay, but I'll do all of that on Monday from 8 a.m. until 11:30 a.m. reviewing whatever the heck students want to ask me about. I'm going to go through literally all of it. It's a cram session. I did it last year. I'm doing it again this year. Whatever you guys need, whatever you guys want. Okay. That should be it for this video. This one did not run the full hour because I went through that 6-graph problem in about 30 minutes. Wow. Okay. If you want to go through that problem yourself, feel free to go back into the video. At the very beginning of the video, I explained, or I paused at different parts whenever I got to different parts of the question so you could attempt it yourself. And then I explained every single thing in the entire problem, fully drew everything exactly the way it would be drawn on the AP exam, all of that stuff. But that is it for today's video. Thank you all for watching as always, and I'll see a lot of you guys on Saturday. Much appreciated, everybody. Have a good one.